My name is Eric Bailey. I'm a state beef nutrition specialist with MU Extension. Co-hosting today is Amy Schleicher. Amy has changed her name in the chat to ask questions here. And our co-host basically monitors the chat since we've muted questions during the course of the presentations. If you would like to ask a question, go ahead and type it in the chat. You can type it to everybody, or you can send it privately to ask questions here, and then Amy will relay that to the group. So, you know, as always, our goal is to provide you all some insight and to interact with MU Extension from a distance. And we always start each of these town halls off with a weather report from Dr. Pat Guinan. And so, Dr. Guinan, I really hope that you added plans for an arc into your weather report today.
I think it's very appropriate, Eric, for this part of for many areas of Missouri. I noticed I'm disabled from screen sharing. Is there it won't let me.
Sorry about that. Got it fixed.
Okay, cool. Let's see. It says I cannot start the screen share while the other participant is sharing.
Okay, there you go.
Okay. Perfect. Got it. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're into July, and boy, June was quite the month weather-wise. Just looking back real quickly, you know, we started out really dry across pretty much all of the state for about the first 3 weeks of June. We started to, when those conditions start drying out the soils and vegetation starts stressing, you provide more opportunities for those temperatures to really sort of get out of control. And fortunately, we did see a pattern change for most of the state, which brought a lot of clouds and rainfall over about the past 12 days or so. But look at these numbers, or these departure from normals here on the left of temperature. You can see where the rains haven't transpired so far this summer across the northern plains, out upper Midwest, much warmer departure from normals for June because of the drought conditions they're experiencing. We've dodged a bullet in that regard for much of the state, and so those high temperatures were suppressed by all the rainfall and cloudiness. And when we look at the month as a whole for the state, generally near average across southern portions, and perhaps 1 to 2 degrees above normal. So not too terrible when you look at the month as a whole for temperature departures. And of course, on the right, again, let's look what's happening to our neighbors in the upper Midwest and the northern plains. They still have severe to extreme drought conditions impacting that part of the country. So not a good scenario, especially when we look at the as we go into the month of July. Well, the rains came, and this is evidence of that. It's a radar estimate showing rainfall over the past 2 weeks. Look at these totals, nothing short of amazing. When you look at this magenta, that's 10 to 15 inches of rain within a 2-week period. That actually fell within about 12 days, so less than 2 weeks. The corridor extends from near St. Joe down through Carroll County, Saline County, over into Howard and Boone County, on eastward into parts of northern Warren and Montgomery County and up to Pike County. Some just amazing totals. Right here, we have even deeper colors of 15 to 20 inches of rain in parts of Howard County, Saline, Boone, over into western Callaway. Just amazing totals. When you get that much rain, obviously in a 2-week period, you're going to see some significant flooding. And, you know, even prior to this, we were actually pretty dry. And so those soils had to recharge. And so it took quite a bit of that initial moisture. But nonetheless, you get this much rain despite antecedent conditions, you're going to see some significant flooding. And that's the case across several of the rivers and streams, even the main stem river, the Missouri River. Some areas in this region experience moderate flooding because of all this rainfall. These would set records for monthly totals, let alone for over a 12-day period. So really provides perspective. These are ground truth reports in the lower left showing those 2-week totals. And again, Howard County, 16.85 inches. Amazing to see these totals. in less than 2 weeks. Saline County, Boone County, Cooper County, of course, that's the heaviest corridor according to this radar estimate. Just so many locations over a foot of rain. And I don't want to leave out areas that haven't been getting the rain over for the month of June and into the first part of July. These are some of the lowest totals from June 18th through July 1st. Right here, these areas of greens and blues in southeast Missouri. Generally, this corridor about 80 miles wide, they haven't seen the rains, and in fact, Poplar Bluff less than a quarter of an inch. Generally a little over ½ inch here in Jackson, Cape Girardeau County. So right now it's encouraging to see there is a pretty good area of showers and thunderstorms associated with the cold front that is moving through southeast Missouri. And so hopefully they will improve those totals over these areas that have been missing out on these rain events, because our best chances for any notable precip over the next several days is going to occur today, and that looks more likely around southeast Missouri where they need it the most. This is the current situation in regard to watches and warnings and advisories. Of course, we still have some river flooding across this area here where we've seen most of the rainfall in west central and parts of north central Missouri. Flash flood watches with heavier precip that has been falling more recently over the past few days. There is a flash flood watch over parts of south central and southwest Missouri until 7 p.m. There's a cluster of counties here in east central Missouri where the flash flood watch is ongoing for about another 45 minutes or so. And then again, here in the upper right shows where the rivers and streams, what they're doing in regard to flood stages. These lighter orange colors are minor flooding. The red colors are moderate flooding. And so it's ongoing across parts of Missouri, especially central sections. A lot of heavy rain up in parts of Illinois too, where they're experiencing some flooding along the Illinois River and other streams and tributaries. So I've consolidated this web link here. If you're in these areas of concern for flooding, you can look at the various resources going to this website, River Information Resources for Missouri. So please feel free to check out that site to get the latest information, local information for your location. Well, it does look like after the rains move out today, much nicer weather starting later today and on into tomorrow and through the holiday weekend. These are the forecast highs in the lower left, generally seasonable to slightly below normal, with the cloudy and rainy conditions over southern Missouri, generally in the upper 70s, low 80s, a little bit more sunshine in northwest Missouri. Northern parts of the state might get into the mid 80s, but look here in the lower right, we deserve some nice weather and we're going to get it for this holiday weekend. So there's some beautiful conditions. Look at these highs over the next few days as we go into the weekend. This is below normal with highs in the upper 70s, low 80s, a little bit more warming on Sunday and Monday, generally more seasonable in the mid to upper 80s, but nice nighttime lows in the upper 50s and lower 60s. And I will emphasize lower humidities, and that is critical. When we see these lower humidities with these types of temperatures, that's just beautiful weather, lots of sunshine. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity to get out and enjoy these nice weather conditions as we go through the holiday weekend. This is a forecast only for the next 24 hours because that is our best chances of significant rainfall for Missouri. Again, there is a frontal boundary moving through the state as I speak. We still have some showers and thunderstorms that could drop some notable rainfall over the next 24 hours, anywhere from a ½ to 1 inch. Some localized areas, if they're under those heavy thunderstorms, could get 2 to 3 inches of precip. That's why they do have flash flood warnings, flash flood watches continuing, because of these localized opportunities for some heavy precipitation. But again, this is the highest likelihood of any more precipitation over the next several days will be occurring over the next 24 hours. The forecast for next week, it does look like here on the left is indicative of that pattern. That's, summer patterns tend to stick around. They're stagnant, and when they set up, they just kind of are, they don't move around much. And so unfortunately, the dry gets drier, and there is potentially this wetness and cool conditions, seasonable conditions. They do have below normal temperatures across much of the southern plains, the southeast, a high likelihood of above normal temperatures. Again, perhaps some record heat in the northern plains and parts of the northern Rockies that extends into the northeast. Missouri is sort of that transition state with warmer conditions to the north, near normal to below normal conditions to the south. And then on the right here, this is precipitation for next week, July 6th through the 10th. There is an enhanced likelihood of some above normal precip. There are indications perhaps a system impacting our state by midweek next week and continuing on into late week. And so that's why they are showing an enhanced likelihood of above normal precip. Unfortunately, below normal precip, again, were the areas that really need some rainfall with the current drought conditions. And the last slide, just as this is something that came out yesterday, according to the Climate Prediction Center, it's the forecast for the month of July. Again, this pattern of summer patterns tend to be somewhat stagnant, and so forecasters are indicating more of the same for the month of July. Unfortunately, above normal temperatures across much of the northern part of the country, a high likelihood here in the Northern Rockies and Pacific Northwest. We have soil moisture conditions that are saturated across much of the state. You know, that's moisture sort of is memory in the system. And so we have a lot of evaporation that will be taking place, and that will mitigate any opportunities for extreme heat. I think if anything, if we do get some hot temperatures in July, I think what will be more concerned will be the high humidities or the high dew points that will, in tandem with high temperatures, could create some very uncomfortable conditions, not only for people, but for livestock and pets, and even crops can suffer from really high humidities and high temperatures. But they are indicating these max temperatures could be suppressed because of all the moisture in the southern plains and that extend into Missouri. And then on the right here, they are indicating somewhat more of an unstable pattern, at least over the next week or two, and then perhaps later in the month, for above average precip, especially across the southern half of the state. Equal chances for the northern half of Missouri when it comes to precip, and not good news for the northern plains, upper Midwest. It looks like that drought is going to persist, at least according to this forecast for the month of July. Eric, that's pretty much a weather report. Thanks so much. I'll hand it back over to you.
Pat, thank you again. Always appreciate your insight into the weather. I really think that's one of the big values that we provide with these Forage Livestock Town Halls. I know I'm sure I'm much more informed on the weather after watching your stuff. So, okay, Amy said there's no questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and move into the next section of our presentation today. So I will be taking on the educational topic for today. We're going to be talking about the results from a recent feeding project that we did up at the Thompson Research Center in north central Missouri in Spickard. This is a picture of a couple of the steers that we fed out in our home feedlot, basically. So just a little bit of background on the Thompson farm. So through the guidance of faculty here on campus, Dave Patterson, Dr. Dave Patterson, Dr. Jared Decker, the Thompson Research Farm has had a long-standing breeding program based on Angus cattle, and their cattle have been selected, and they've chosen genetics that are really growth and carcass oriented. And what Thompson has done historically has retained ownership in their steer calves, and then shipped them out to feedlots to finish out so that they could collect performance data during the feedlot phase, but then also, you know, carcass data on the rail as well, and use that information to feed back into the system to make more informed breeding decisions for their cow herd. Now, we were fortunate that 2 years ago, there was an opportunity that came available to get some funding from the USDA to invest in rural business development. And a pitch was made at the time then to invest in cattle feeding infrastructure up at Thompson so that we could take those steers and rather than ship them elsewhere for feeding, we could keep them at home and you know, feed them out on the farm. You couple that with the advent of the Missouri Prime Beef Packing Plant down in Pleasant Hope, Missouri, and just there's some interest in cattle feeding in this state once again, and it's pretty easy to see why when you think about it. We produce about 1.7 million calves per year here in the state of Missouri, and our colleagues over in ag business, I think they estimate that maybe 50,000 calves are actually fed to harvest in the state. In fact, I believe we only background about 500,000 calves out of the 1.7 million in the state. And so if you think about it from a different perspective, you know, we have over 1 million head of calves that are leaving the state basically at weaning every year. And, you know, as the University of Missouri Extension has the goal of, you know, doubling our economic impact of Missouri agriculture by the year 2030, you begin to see how perhaps putting weight on calves post weaning is a low hanging fruit for MU Extension to pursue that goal. Now, Missouri has historically not been a cattle feeding state, and I think there are a variety of reasons why, and that's related to infrastructure, to you know, institutional knowledge, to climate, you know, the precipitation, the summer temps, the cold winters. There's a number of factors that have put a lid on that. And, you know, I like to think about it a little differently, though. I like to think about cattle feeding and developing these infrastructure based in terms of competitive advantages. Missouri has a couple of big competitive advantages. The proximity of calves in this neighborhood. I mean, we're the third largest beef cow inventory in the United States of any state. We're also, you know, in close proximity to feedstuffs, and in fact, as you'll see here in the Thompson farm results, you know, being able to procure commodities and store them effectively was a lot of our sales pitch for cattle feeding infrastructure. And for anybody who's tracked the market in the last 6 months, the commodity market, you know, corn has doubled, and we were able to lock in that corn price before we had the dramatic escalation. And so it really influences the results in some of our feeding. Now, again, here at Thompson, we've also had, you know, decades of focus and emphasis on, you know, growth traits in the cow herd, carcass quality, you know, so we have historically had an above average portion of calves from this farm that will grade prime at harvest. And so a really white tablecloth beef type focus. Now, our original plan was we used funds from the USDA grant that was received at the farm to build a commodity barn. And, you know, unfortunately, due to some building delays and some fund availability delays, we weren't able to get the barn completed in time for it to really be useful for us during the first year of feeding. This is just a picture of it here, but as you'll note here in subsequent slides, we managed these cattle a little differently than what we had set out to do originally. Originally, we had intended to procure commodities, store them in this commodity barn, you know, mix a ration in a feed wagon and deliver that daily. Instead, what we ended up doing was we ended up using a self-feeder, essentially a corn and protein pellet mixture that would go into the self-feeder and offer free choice availability of forage to these cattle. So there were 81 steers that were weaned on September 9th. They weighed on average 616 pounds at weaning. Now we split them into two groups to either background them for 45 or 90 days before we put them on a finishing diet. Now, throughout backgrounding and finishing, the cattle had free choice access to some kind of a concentrate pellet in a self-feeder, in addition to fescue hay available free choice in a bale ring. The fescue hay was nearly 10% crude protein and about 54% TDN on a dry matter basis. Across both groups, the cattle consumed about 4.9 pounds of hay disappeared per head per day. Now, I say disappeared rather than consumed because we weren't super diligent in tracking any waste out of the hay ring feeders. So I wouldn't necessarily want to publish this data set, but our best estimate is that the cattle consumed near to 5 pounds of forage per head per day. Now, the cattle were fed in two groups. This wasn't replicated. This isn't research that we're going to go on. This is more of a demonstration deal. But both groups were essentially were managed using MFA products. Okay, and so when we weaned them, cattle were weaned onto a product called Cattle Charge, soy hull based pellet that's produced by MFA. after they transitioned to cattle charge, they went to a 50-50 blend of Cadence, another MFA pelleted product, plus corn at that 50-50 ratios on an as-fed basis. When we started the finishing phase, we switched the cattle to Endpoint, which is a protein pellet that's intended to be a supplement in addition to corn when fed to free choice animals. And we fed that at about a 15% Endpoint, 85% corn ratio. Now, the feedstuffs that we used all contained rumensin, the ionophore, in them. And the cattle charge phase and the cadence phase would be what we call backgrounding, or what you'll see throughout the slide referred to as backgrounding, and that the finishing cattle were just on Endpoint. Here's a picture of our facilities. You can see that we had about a 12-foot concrete pad in the front of the bunk. The waterers were located about 2/3 of the way back in the pen. We placed the self feeders and the hay ring up on the concrete pad of the bunk. These cattle were fed from September 29th of 2020. The last group was harvested on May 4th of 2021. The steers were implanted with Synovex 1 feedlot implant on December 21st, 2020. And we started out with 81 head. We lost 2 over the course of the feeding time. One got his back downhill during a cold spell and did not get up. The second one, I believe we lost due to an injury, but I'd have to go back and confirm that. And we estimated harvest date for these cattle. We split them actually into 2 groups. So we sent a load on April 20th and we sent the remaining balance on May 4th. We estimated harvest date based on a visual appraisal. And since this is an extension and an educational event, I thought this would be a good opportunity to take to kind of walk y'all through our visual appraisal process. So these pictures were taken of the steers on April 14th or 16th. We got two steers that would be representative. I want to point out a few things that I look for that would tell me that these animals were near to ready for harvest. And I'm basically just going to work from the bottom up. And so you'll notice that the brisket in these cattle are quite full, and that it's full to a point where you're starting to notice them walking, or the width between their hooves is spread out wide. That's an indicator that I like to use quite a bit. The second thing you'll notice is that their shoulders begin to really protrude out, in conjunction with them walking really wide out in their front. Their top line is round, or is flat and quite level, and wide as well. And then finally, they've got fat in and around their tail heads. Those were the indicators that we used as a visual appraisal. And so the farm crew there would have sorted off the first 35 head and shipped them based on that visual appraisal. So I'm going to go ahead and share some of the results from this. I'm going to split it into each group individually, and we're just going to kind of walk through a timeline. So as a reminder, the calves were weaned on the 29th of September. Both groups were. And the 45-day calves, so the calves that were backgrounded for 45 days, were switched to a finishing diet on November 24th, okay? So here's the performance of those 45-day steers during backgrounding. So there were 39 head. They were on feed for about 48 days. They gained 3.06 pounds per day with an estimated daily feed intake on an as-fed basis of 16.56 pounds. So a feed to gain of roughly 5.4 pounds of feed per pound of gain. We fed these cattle approximately 31,000 pounds of feed that cost roughly $4,200. And so a metric that I really like to use when I'm going maybe from a cow-calf perspective to a feedlot perspective, I really use feed cost of gain as an important metric. And the feed cost of gain in this case for this set of cattle backgrounding was 73 cents per pound of gain. Now, we implanted these steers with Synovex 1 on December 21st of 2020. On April the 20th, 25 head out of the 39 were harvested at Missouri Prime Beef Packers in Pleasant Hope, Missouri. The remaining 14 head in this group were harvested on May 2nd, 2021. Okay, and so here's the performance of these 45-day steers during finishing. So they were on feed for roughly 160 days. Their final body weight was 1,366 pounds. They gained 3.76 pounds per day. Now on an as-fed basis, their daily feed intake, so that's both the grain plus the hay, was roughly 33 pounds per head per day. Now again, that's on an as-fed basis, and so that as-fed number would have been used to calculate this feed to gain value. The 90-day steers were also weaned on September 29th. They were backgrounded for longer, and they were switched to a step-up diet on November the 30th. And so here's their backgrounding performance. So these steers came off a backgrounding weighing 840 pounds. They were average daily gain 2.65 pounds per day. They ate 15.29 pounds of feed per day with a feed to gain of roughly 5.78 to 1. Important to note, the difference in performance between these two groups may have been that these cattle were out on pasture as well during most of this time. So they would have had access to stockpiled tall fescue. So that daily feed intake may not necessarily be as representative as the other group was. These cattle ate we purchased 52,000 pounds of feed for them at a cost of roughly $8,100, and our feed cost to gain in this case was 90 cents. Steers were switched to the finishing diet and implanted with Synovex 1 on December 21st, 2020. Now, 10 head out of this 90-day group were deemed ready for harvest with the first group on April 20th, and they were harvested at Missouri Prime as well with the others. The remaining balance were harvested on May 2nd. So 40 steers in this group, they came off, their final body weight was 1,348 pounds. They were on the finishing diet for 128 days. They gained roughly 3.97 pounds per day. Daily feed intake, 33.88 pounds, and a pretty similar feed to gain as the previous group. Again, a daily feed intake is on an as-fed basis, so that feed to gain calculation is also on an as-fed basis. So now what I've done is I've taken the data and I've put them together just to give you all one kind of summary of the group, especially as we look at them on the rail. So these cattle dressed 62.6%. Their average carcass weight, so that's not the final live body weight, but that's instead knocking the head, the offal off, was 828 pounds. They ranged from 700 to 950 pound carcasses. Now, our yield grade distribution, so if you'll recall, a yield grade 1 is an animal with little to no subcutaneous fat. Marbling, a yield grade 5 would be an excessively fat animal. Our yield grade distribution of the 79 head that were harvested, there were 62 that landed yield grade 3, and we only had 2 yield grade 5s and 3 yield grade 4s, which typically yield grade 4s and 5s will generate discounts when those animals are marketed on a grid or a formula basis. So little to no discount there for yield grade. In fact, as a nutritionist and as somebody who works with a lot of feedlot cattle, we really hit this yield grade pretty well. I was very pleased to see that the majority of these cattle were in that yield grade 3 range. Quality grade distribution. So we had 11 out of the 79 calves grade prime. We had only 1 out of the 79 grade select. And so we had 14% prime in among this group. We had the remaining balance of them saved for the 1 grade choice. So an above average distribution of prime relative to what we have going on in the country, across the country right now. So indicative of that breeding and management plan that Doctors Patterson, Decker, and also I forgot to mention my colleague Jordan Thomas, who does a lot of the reproductive physiology work for Thompson. So just a testament to that group's efforts to really breed better beef. So now I want to look at a summary of the 45-day steers. Okay, so we we spent about $23,500 in feed over the course of this trial, and our feed cost to gain over the entire experiment was, or the entire feeding period, was about 80 cents per pound of gain. The steers were sold for an average sales price of $1,679.90 per pound, and that would include $76 per head in premiums for quality grade. And the way let me break down how I calculated return over feed costs. So I went to the Oklahoma City Stockyards market news report on September 29th, 2020. I chose the largest stockyard in the country, and I picked an animal that would be representative. So a medium and large #1 black-hided steer, and I got sales price off of them. So I assigned a value to the Thompson calves at weaning, even though we didn't sell any of these calves. I added feed costs on top of that. I added the freight from the trucking on to that as well on a per head basis. And so then I basically subtracted the feed, the trucking, and the assigned value at weaning from the sales price to develop or evaluate the return over feed costs. And so, you know, that came out to be $183 a head in this instance. I have to point out, I'm really thankful that MFA allowed us to lock corn in, because we locked in corn at a much cheaper rate than what it ended up being over the course of the way that feed prices escalated over the past 8 months. So we being able to secure our commodities and lock in the price on them was a really big factor in this puzzle. One thing that's not included in this return over feed cost that I think is entirely relevant is that we did not charge ourselves a yardage fee, and we could very much have done so. And a yardage fee is the fee that's assessed for your time, your labor, your equipment, your fuel, etc. That's what most custom feedlots would have charged. And you know, custom feeding yardage rates, you know, range from 40 to 50 to 60 cents depending on the location. They also typically are going to put some sort of a markup on the feed as well, to cover any inventory shrink or losses on the feedlot end. So markup on the feed that would be common in a custom yard, and yardage is not included in that calculation of return over feed costs, and is very relevant to discuss. The 90-day steers had an 85-cent cost of gain. They sold for $1,642.86 per pound, or per head, I'm sorry. And they returned, their return over feed costs were about $125.47 relative to that difference between sales price and then the value at weaning, the feed and the freight as well. So that's all I've got. I see the chat thing is blinking at me, so I'll go ahead and stop right there. And Amy, if you kind of want to guide me through this, I'm happy to answer any questions y'all might have.
Yeah, Eric, so we did have a question come in. How much of the profit that you're showing is represented by premiums? Okay, so the steers premium were $76 per head. So, you know, in the 45-day steers, you know, you're talking about, you know, $76 in premium and $107 in return over feed costs, irrespective of that premium. In the 90-day group, you're talking about essentially $50 in premium over, or $50 in profit over the premium that was generated from harvesting those cattle. So great question. Okay, we had another one. How significant to profits are the genetics of the cattle you're feeding?
That's a really good question, and that question is dependent upon the business model. So if you're a cow-calf producer who's looking at feeding cattle out your own genetics, you know, I think a lot of folks who get into that type of a vertically integrated system, they learn pretty quickly what their genetics are and what they are not, unfortunately. And I say that because I find a lot of value out of looking at programs like Eldon Cole's steer feed out in Southwest Missouri. You know, there is such a wide array or diversity in the profit that is garnered among those farms that, you know, it's you can start to see cattle profit based on sort of kind of the management objectives of the farm. Certainly, if you think about it from a 30,000 foot view, you know, it's kind of hard to think about, you know, like Coriani type cattle being all that profitable to feed unless I'm producing them for, you know, pennies on the dollar. I think genetics are an important piece, but I wouldn't necessarily say that genetics are the only piece. Genetics are one piece of several that work together to make this system function. But it's not the only piece that is going to ensure that a person who is interested in going down this route is going to be profitable. There's a lot of management.
Okay, we had another one. Just to clarify, your feeding period, was it primarily during the winter months or did it run through the hot weather too?
Okay, so the cattle were fed so they were weaned on September 29th, 2020. The last group left the feedlot on May 4th. So the cattle were fed in open air lots. They had a concrete pad, about a 12-foot concrete pad in the front, but there was no shade. There was no wind break, nothing along those lines. They were not, it wasn't hot yet. And that's kind of part of the beauty, honestly, if you think about a spring calving system and then what we would call a calf-fed feedlot model, where you wean those calves and you push them hard right away, get them up on feed and go. They really marry pretty nicely. At least they did in this case for us, that we were able to get these cattle shipped before it got hot. Now, the second piece of that I think is relevant in the answer, and I know I'm getting kind of long-winded here, but typically when you look at futures contract prices for cattle, the strongest futures contract is the contract that covers the months of March and April, which would correspond with packing plants harvesting cattle for grilling, or harvesting cattle and generating beef for grilling season. And so we were able to actually get these cattle on the April contract, and I believe that was helpful as well.
You mentioned feed prices earlier, and a question came in: are alternative feedstuffs a good option to avoid high grain prices?
Well, so that's a great question. Unfortunately, corn is kind of king in the commodity market, and the price of corn is going to drive the price of a lot of everything else right now. I really wish that soybean hulls were, you know, $120 a ton like they normally are this time of year. Instead, they're double that this year, just like corn is. Distiller's grain, you know, being a byproduct of ethanol production and a corn byproduct, it typically is priced in somewhere between 90 and 95% the price of a bushel of corn. You know, so we've seen distillers grains go up this year. Yeah, there's some real headwinds in the cattle feeding industry right now in terms of feed prices. I'm seeing, you know, those, I showed you cost of gains, feed cost of gains that were, or I showed you cost of gains that were 80 cents in this example. You know, feedlot cost of gains right now are $1.10, $1.15. So, you know, it's really difficult for feedlots to be profitable when cattle are selling for $1.20 a pound and you have to spend $1.15. There's just not a lot of profit margin right there. But to go back to that original question, when you're putting these rations together for feedlot cattle, especially as you go into that finishing phase, you really want to be cognizant of what the energy content of what you're feeding these cattle are. You really want to work with somebody, whether that's a feed company, a nutritionist, an independent nutritionist, university extension. You know, you want to formulate a ration that is as energy dense as you possibly can if you're going the grain-fed commodity beef kind of route. And so, you know, for example, I used soy hulls as a comparison earlier. The difference in energy between soy hulls and corn is drastic enough to notice. And unfortunately, when it comes to grain-based cattle feeding, corn, barley, wheat, I mean, some of these really energy dense cereal grains, they're king. They need to be the basis of the diet to keep our performance up, to keep our cattle efficiency up, and really in most cases to keep those feed cost gains in check.
Had a couple of questions come in regarding profitability. And the first one, in addition to the ones that we had so far, was profitability tracked individually? And if so, what was the range between the most profitable to the least profitable animal?
So that's a great question. I have all of the information to track profitability individually, but for time constraints, I did not. So I took averages of the group and used the averages for calculation. I sure could do that, but to be honest, I kind of like seeing my family a little bit too. I should consider doing that going forward, but it just hasn't been done yet.
Sure. And then do you think profitability would have been different using a northern market for your base price versus Oklahoma City?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So would my base price have been different? The base price that was used from September 29th, the base price that I used when I was developing the value of these steers was $1.45 a pound. Now, I should have checked. I don't know why, thinking about it now, why I didn't just use Joplin's price or maybe even somewhere north of I-70. That's a fair question. I don't know what that base price, but I do remember specifically that it was $1.45.20 a pound. I expected that question to come up, so I looked at it, and so that base price certainly has an influence in this look at return over feed cost as well, because certainly the value of the animal at weaning, that's relevant to this calculation.
Another question: did you see any differences in carcass characteristics between the two feeding regimes?
So differences in carcass characteristics, I can't say differences just because we didn't have any replication and it wasn't an experiment. There was a difference in weight between the two groups. I'll go back, apologies for the slide. So the 90-day steers their final body weight was 1348. The 45-day steers 1366. So we had, I don't know, an 18-pound difference in final body weight. But in terms of carcass characteristics, we didn't see a whole lot of differences there. I do want to point a couple of things out about this that's relevant to this discussion. One calf got one dose of antibiotic one time throughout this entire trial, and just for the interest of being sort of candid, part of our motivation towards an on-farm feeding demonstration at Thompson was that we had some health challenges at a couple of different feedlots that these steers had been sent to in previous years. And we had death loss that would have been above industry average based on that. Now, granted, when it's a small group, and each animal dying represents over 1% death loss, that certainly influences that outcome. But we'd had some health challenges in these cattle in previous years, and the steers that we fed and under the management system we had at Thompson last year, we had zero health challenges.
Another question just came in. How big was the feedlot that you used, and what was the stocking density?
So the feedlot pen size, I believe our stocking density was about 300 square foot per head. And I don't remember what the dimensions of the pins were right offhand, but there was something a little bit different about this. So we had the cattle in 4 pins, divvied across 4 pins, but we actually had 8 pins available to us. And so we actually rotated those cattle through the pins as pin conditions started to deteriorate a little bit when we got wet during the winter. And so we were able to kind of get them in a dry spot, honestly. And just to be clear, so when we were backgrounding those cattle, the 90-day cattle were out on stockpile tall fescue pasture. The 45-day cattle were in about a 3-acre sort of a dry lot, but not those true feedlot pens. So those cattle were only finished in the feeding facility that I showed you all a picture of earlier.
So maybe based on your experience with this demonstration, do you plan to continue feeding cattle at the research center?
Great question, Amy. So we actually this year, rather than so historically, we've defined a breeding season and artificially inseminated replacement heifers. Any heifers that didn't take to the first round of AI were kept around, exposed to a bull natural service, and then marketed as you know, essentially bull breds to somebody else. This year, we kept a greater proportion of heifers as replacements. One round of AI, anything that didn't stick is now currently in that feedlot. And so we're trying, it's not quite a heiferette in so much as, you know, open 2-year-olds, but we're trying kind of a modified heiferette type approach. There's 27 heifers that went on feed this week, and I'm going up there to implant those next week. Our plan is to feed them out. I'm projecting they currently weigh about 850 pounds. We'll probably harvest them sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas. We're also planning to feed the steers out again this coming year under a very similar management system.
Great, thank you. And we had a comment that from someone that said they were looking forward to seeing those heifer feedlot results.
Well,
also wanted.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say we'll be glad to share them with y'all.
So you showed your picture of the commodity shed early on in your presentation. So, you know, future plans for research in that regard, like different feeding programs, things like that.
Yeah, so our plan is we're, you know, just like everybody else, we've really kind of taken a haircut with COVID and everything else. Our plan was to have a TMR wagon, already a mixer wagon already, and to be going to a TMR based feeding management program. You know, I think there's a really interesting opportunity to do some comparisons between self-fed and TMR mixer wagon type management systems in the future there. We certainly have the room to split them up and make groups and to actually accomplish some replication. You know, overall, I thought the cattle performed really well on the self-feed system. And quite honestly, the self-feed system, one of the things that, especially for a small producer who's just getting started, you know, there's a lot of flexibility in management that goes along with something like that, not being tied to having to feed those cattle, you know, once a day and fire up your tractor and your wagon. I believe we received feed deliveries from MFA every, I think, 7 to 10 days. They delivered feed, dumped it in there. Our responsibility was basically to go check the feed pan every morning, stir it around, make sure there wasn't manure and junk in there, because, you know, in a self-fed system like that, you typically will give cattle about 4 inches of bunk space, whereas in a TMR, you're giving them a foot of bunk space. And so if you have a spot in the bunk that spoils, or you have manure or something like that, that's not really that big of an issue for cattle in a TMR type system. Now in a self-fed system, you know, that could definitely push these cattle off feed. You know, we could have some issues with that. You know, I'm interested in making that comparison and really sort of trying to help support producers who might be interested in going this route, but also looking at it from a low cost, kind of low input way. So there was a 2-minute answer to a 30-second question.
Nope, that's great. That would be cool research. We look forward to hearing about that. So that is all the questions we've got.
Okay, well, that's great. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's presentation. I just want to share with y'all that we have all of these videos will be posted on the MUIPM YouTube channel page. We now post every town hall in their entirety on there. So if anybody misses anything or you want to share it with somebody, might find this information value, if you go to the MUIPM or the MU Integrated Pest Management YouTube channel, you should be able to find this and, quite honestly, about 45 videos that we've created doing these Forage Livestock Town Halls over the last 15, 16 months. The second thing that I want to share with y'all before we close up is that Jim Humphrey, Sean Deering, Wesley Tucker, and I are planning what we're going to call our first feedlot school. This school will be held August 4th and 5th up in Trenton, Missouri, and it's going to be a 2-day school. We're hoping to take producers that are interested in, feeding cattle in the state that may be already feeding cattle. They may just be working on their business plans, and we're going to try to teach you all the ins and outs of feeding cattle in Missouri. Nutrition, health management. We're going to show you all this data at Thompson. We're going to visit a local confinement feeding facility. We'll also go to MU Thompson. You can see where we did the trial that I showed you all today. And we're going to really spend some time not just working in the business, learning how to manage feedlots and feedlot cattle, but also working on the business. So I'm really excited about our plan to work with some partners to really kind of help understand and evaluate the financial aspects of maybe pursuing this cattle feeding enterprise in the state. So the registration info will be coming up real soon. We're going to have a website on CVent that can be shared. You can register directly on there. And if you have any questions, just feel free to send me an email or to reach out to Jim or Sean or Wesley, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. So that's all I've got for today. Thank you all for joining in. I'm glad to see y'all, and I hope y'all have a wonderful and relaxing and slightly dry 4th of July. So bye now.